So much. Hi, everybody. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and I lead our bumblebee conservation programs, which means a whole host of things, but most relevant to this conversation today, it means I supervise a team of folks that are working on bumblebee Atlas projects across the state. We're active in 21 states, and I collaborate with a team of 7 folks here at Xerces that are running these projects. And I'm going to talk to you today about those projects, why we started doing them, and then also some of the results that we've seen, and with also opportunities for you all to get involved if that's something that you would like to do. I'm sure that I unfortunately over the last couple of days have been extraordinarily busy and haven't had a lot of time. But I know a lot of folks have given talks from Xerces, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about our organization, but I just will remind folks that we are a member-supported organization, and if you're already a member, thank you so much. And if you're not yet a member and have appreciated all the Xerces talks and the work that we do, please do consider becoming a member right now. Membership is more important than it ever has been before. And so we appreciate you all and welcome you to join us. We're largely here today because of, the known decline of insects. And I don't need to spend a lot of time belaboring it, but most any group of insects that we look at are experiencing some degree of declines. And it doesn't really matter the scale that we look at or the type of decline that we look at. Species declines, biomass declines, abundance declines. They're all happening, and they're happening at broad scales. They're happening to common animals. They're happening to rare animals. And I think we know enough now to know that we need to do something about it. We're going to focus in today on bumblebees, and in bumblebees, we've learned over the last 15 years or so that around a quarter of our bumblebees are facing some degree of extinction risk, and this is according to some work that I did for the IUCN for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Bumblebee Specialist Group that I'm going to talk to you just briefly about in the coming slides. And as we all know, invertebrates are the foundation or the fabric of our world. They keep the ecosystem moving, whether that means pollination, which is what we're largely focusing on today, on pest control, on reducing the need for chemical inputs, on feeding wildlife, both directly and indirectly, on maintaining soil health, on filtering water, and on dispersing seeds. Insects are truly out there, creating the world that we're seeing. And without healthy insect and invertebrate populations, obviously, a lot of these systems begin to collapse. And the threats to those animals are largely, we sort of know big picture threats. We know that pesticides are a problem. We know that light pollution is a problem for some of these animals. Climate change is a big problem. Introduced species and managed species are a problem. Habitat loss is a problem. But all of these problems are large and difficult to solve. It's also difficult to come up with and pinpoint the exact threat to a specific animal. And I think the take home from all of that is we may not know what the specific problems are or what the specific threat is, but we know enough about what these animals do and what they need that we can start acting now without the specific answer. And so while we're doing research, while we're learning more about the declines of these animals, it's incredibly important for us to start building a better habitat now, even if we don't have the perfect information. So keep putting those plants in the ground, keep reducing the use of toxic insecticides out there, and make the world a better place. And we can all start doing that now, even if we don't have the perfect answer. And so what a great opportunity for us to gather in this best practices for pollinators summit so that we can share what we learn and do a better job and keep moving the science forward so that we can continue to do better and better things for this incredibly important group of animals. When most people think about species conservation, I think they sort of think of a flow chart that looks somewhat like this, where there's a community out there doing research, they're engaging and the public and the research community are working on habitat management, and that's helping to improve the status of species out there. And this is largely how it works. A lot of species conservation on the ground work happens using a flow chart that looks something like this. But what I want to remind folks is that I think the flowchart's bigger than that, and that policy and advocacy are actually a significant component of this. Policy and advocacy are ways that we engage the public. It provides funding for research, and it provides funding and regulation for habitat work that also benefit these animals. So to a certain degree, I think that policy and advocacy and using and allowing research to inform that policy and advocacy can really change how we do work. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is really how some of the results from the Bumblebee Atlas project that we have been running for the last 8 years have helped to inform some of that policy and advocacy and some of the outcomes that have come from it. The Bumblebee Conservation Story for Xerces started in the mid-2000s, and it was largely surrounded on the decline of these 4 species: the western bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and the rusty-patched bumblebee. And these 4 species, once somewhat common in their respective ranges, had begun to precipitously decline. And so researchers like Robin Thorpe and Sheila Kola started raising the red flag about these 4 species and saying, hey, I think we need to pay attention to bumblebee conservation. And I just do want to invite these 2 conservation giants into the virtual room with us today. Sheila Kola here on the left, and Dr. Robin Thorpe on the right, and it's Dr. Sheila Kola as well on the left. Unfortunately, over the last several years, both of these individuals who made incredible contributions to bumblebee conservation have passed away, and our community is very missing their presence, as their contributions will be felt. For they're certainly both mentors and inspiration to me, and I think they were to many people. And so I think it's important to remember their legacy and to honor that legacy as we continue to talk about bumblebee conservation in North America. And aligned with sort of the goal of we need to do something now, before we started these Bumblebee Atlas projects, we did put out this book called Conserving Bumblebees, which talks about best management practices. This was put out it's over a decade now. I think it was put out in 2013. So it's been well over a decade since this has been out. It's made its ways into the hands of thousands of land managers, and has certainly improved the way that we're managing lands for bumblebees. And likewise, that when we did the IUCN assessments that found that around a quarter of our bumblebee species were facing some degree of extinction risk, this is what the state of the data looked like across 2013. All of those blue dots that you see on the map were presence points for bumblebees. So you can see there are some parts of the country along the northeastern seaboard, along the west coast, and in Colorado, and to a certain degree in Utah, we had a decent amount of information on bumblebees, but you can see there's large swaths of the country where we really didn't have that many observations. And this is kind of a gaping, or led us to understand that there was kind of a gaping hole, and that we needed to do a better job of gathering data so that we could make more informed conservation decisions. But at that time, with that data set, we still wanted to assess the extinction risk of bumblebees. And so for each individual species, we built these range polygons. The green polygon here represents the historic range of Bombus viridis, and the purple polygon represents the current or most recent range. And so what you can see left of the green there, to a certain degree, or from one perspective, could represent a range loss for that particular species. But if you look at those polygons of range loss, and you behind that look at sampling density or how intensively we've looked for animals in those ranges, you can see there's a lot of very light colors indicating that we really haven't looked that closely. So is it that those animals have disappeared from those areas, or is it that nobody has looked and that's why we don't have that? And so that really flags some big problems that we had with the data back in 2013 when we started this process, is that we had to make a lot of assumptions, and making assumptions obviously isn't going to do the best possible job of informing best conservation policy and best conservation decision making. So we set out to build a data set that would allow us to make more informed conservation decisions so we could best use the conservation resources that we had. And these were directed at these mostly, the quarter species that we mentioned that were facing some degree of extinction risk. And that's the 10 species largely that you see here on this chart, or this graphic that I made. And their IUCN ranks are listed underneath their names, and you can see these 10 species in North America, according to the analysis that we did in 2013, we're facing some degree of extinction risk. And so the question becomes, how do we prioritize these animals? What do we do about them? And how do we find the best way forward? Well, one thing that's happened is a lot of these animals have been petitioned for endangered species protection. The Xerces Society petitioned Franklin's bumblebee for endangered species protection, and it was added to the Endangered Species Act. Similarly, we submitted a petition for the rusty patch bumblebee, and it was added to the Endangered Species Act. And then other entities have petitioned other species that are now somewhere in the pipeline of getting assessed by the Fish and Wildlife Service for endangered species protection. And then more recently, the Xerces Society submitted a federal petition for Bombus morrisoni and a state petition in California for Bombus crotcheti. So all of these species are now somewhere in the pipeline of receiving endangered species recognition. And that's one thing that's been done for these animals. But again, looking at the state of the data and the overlap of ranges of these species that we're looking at, you can see that a lot of the species that are threatened have ranges that have been pretty poorly sampled in the last 20 years, or at least that was the case in 2013. So again, we're making a lot of assumptions about these animals without maybe the best data that we had available, or we could possibly have. And again, back to this graphic of just looking at the undersampled areas of some of these imperiled species. And so we set about with partners to change the way that we gather data and to change the spatial scale at which we were gathering data. And what we decided to do was to launch this project that we called the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. It started in 2018. It was in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And we split the region up into 50-kilometer by 50-kilometer grid cells, and we sought to recruit the general public or community scientists to go out and gather systematic data for us so that we could use these data for conservation purposes. And over the course of the following 6 years, we successfully engaged thousands of volunteers that went out and collected tens of thousands of bumblebee observations for us and conducted surveys across the region. On the left here, you can see the data that we gathered from 2018 to 2023 from that program. And you can just see that when you give community scientists specific direction to go out and gather data in particular locations, they'll listen to you and they'll go out and do that work for you. If we had just sort of relied on the general public to go out and survey where they wanted to, which I think is reflected on the iNaturalist graph on the right, you can see that we're still left with those huge survey gaps in really important areas for some of these species. And if I drop the surveys from the Bumblebee Atlas project onto the iNaturalist map, you can just get a sense of how well our volunteers for the Atlas were able to go out and fill those survey gaps for us. And we've been able to take this program that we started in the Pacific Northwest in 2018 And we've now expanded into 21 states, or will be in 21 states in 2026. We just added New Mexico. And you can see that as we do this, we're dramatically changing the scale and pattern at which data is collected for the species of bumblebees across North America. We've engaged almost 5,000 participants in this program who have conducted well over 20,000 surveys and have gathered close to 150,000 observations of 36 species of bumblebees. So it's really been a very successful program that has created this data set that's available to the community to make conservation decisions. If you're interested more about what's going on in your neck of the woods, the QR code on this page will take you to our data highlights and dashboard where you can explore and interact with the results from the specific regions of the country where we're running this program. And so again, looking back at where we were in 2013, this was the state of the data back then, and accelerating now to 2025, you can see that we've filled in the boundaries of many of those states and have much better information about the status of these animals, particularly across the Western United States where the Atlas program is most active. And from that, we've learned a lot about some of these animals. Some of them are more common than we thought they would be. Bombus pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee, is one of those animals. The Southern Plains bumblebee, Bombus fraternus, is another one that appears to be more common than we thought. And then there are several animals that are much less common even than we might have suspected. Our Atlas projects have still not detected Bombus sucklei, Bombus variabilis, or Bombus franklini. Bombus affinis, you can see the rusty patch bumblebee is very close to the bottom of our commonness scale. And other species as well continue to exhibit patterns of decline. But the patterns of some species being more common than others helps us potentially to prioritize. Although I should add a caveat that we're not necessarily surveying these animals throughout the entirety of their range. This is only in the portions where we're doing these Atlas surveys. But nevertheless, we have learned quite a bit about the status of some of these animals, and can help to move conservation action forward towards the animals that potentially need it most. And one of the things that we're doing is, now that we have this broad scale inventory that gives us indicators of how species are doing, we can take a region like the Pacific Northwest where we've completed the inventory work, and we can shift more towards monitoring. So now we've established these permanent survey stations across the Pacific Northwest. We're continuing to interact and recruit community science volunteers to go out and do surveys for us. But we're focusing now not on a broad inventory, but specifically on monitoring for particular species. And this will allow us to establish the status and trends of these animals, and then begin to look at the drivers of those trends so that we can begin to look closer at what the threats are and how we help ameliorate those threats, and potentially enact on-the-ground management where we can reverse those trends and help species recover. And so this is where our Atlas programs head in their phase 2. After we finish the broad inventory, we can move closer towards monitoring, which allows us to practice adaptive management. And in 2026, the programs that are in gray here will be continuing the inventory work, and the programs that are listed in purple on this map will be shifting towards a long-term monitoring program. So we're really excited about this shift and moving towards monitoring and helping to better inform these practices and conservation management on the ground moving forward. And this is the team of folks that I'm working with across the 21 states. We have different leaders and managers in all different parts of the country. And so I just want to say that, while I'm here talking to you today, it's the work of all of these fantastic individuals that make that possible. And I want to acknowledge them All these folks are Xerces employees stationed throughout the country. And if you're interested in joining our program in 2026, the QR code there on the left will take you to our Find Your Atlas page where you can find who your coordinator is and connect with them. And the QR code on the right will take you to our mailing list where you can sign up to receive our newsletters and learn more about our program moving forward. I'm going to pause just for a second in case you want to use those QR codes. And we'll go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I can put them back up later if anybody wants. And then also from this information that we've now gathered with our 150,000 bumblebee observations, we also have host plant data. So we can begin to look at what plants are important for bumblebees and how we build plant lists that will help those species to recover. I do want to note that as we look at these plant lists that we have developed, that for the most part, we are reflecting bumblebee plant usage and not bumblebee plant preference. And what do I mean by that? Well, mostly we don't really know our Atlas program, while it does gather some habitat data, we don't have detailed quantitative information about the plant community at each one of the specific locations where we gather data. So while we can say what plants bumblebees were using, we can't necessarily say that those are the plants that they prefer because they may have just been using what was available to them at that location. Nevertheless, it is information that we can use to help us understand which plants are important for bumblebees in different areas, but I do want to have some caution on the difference between use and preference. So be careful as you interpret these graphs, and don't feel like if you just put Monarda on the landscape that you're going to solve the world's bumblebee problems. And I'll show you some more reasons for that in a second here. And so generally, I think people consider bumblebees to be generalists, that they'll feed on whatever. And I just want to throw a little caution into that as you think about managing land for bumblebees out there on the landscape. So on this graph are 2 species of bumblebee, Bombus crotchtii on the left here, and Bombus melanopygus on the right. Bombus melanopygus is a hyperabundant species in the western United States, in Oregon, Washington, and California. It's probably one of the top 2 or 3 most common species. And Bombus crotchtii is one of our species of conservation concern. And so the reason I put this graph up is if we were interested in building a plant list and we used the data from only the most abundant species out there, say melanopygus, we would miss a lot of host plants that appear to be quite important for Bombus crotchtii, which is a species of concern. So, if we built it on Bombus melanopygus, we would miss Asclepias or milkweeds. We might not include Phacelia. And then all of those plants at the bottom of that graph, we may not include in a plant list, but those are all, or some of those are the most important plants for Crotch's bumblebees. So I just want to, throw some caution in the wind here, and just saying that bumblebees are generalists, I think oversimplifies the nature of what's going on out there. And my concern is if we just build plant lists about the most common, or from data from the most common species, we run the risk of making common species more common while the rare species become more rare. So gathering more data on plant usage and plant preference is incredibly important moving forward as we think about restoration management for bumblebee species. Likewise, if we look at different plants and different plant compounds, specifically here on this slide, we're looking at the use of Asclepias or milkweeds by bumblebees. Milkweeds contain toxic nectar, which isn't suitable for all animals. There's some knowledge that the Columinobombus subgenus, which includes Bombus crotchtii, Bombus fraternus, and Bombus grizzioculus that you see at the top of this graph on the right, all are known to have some ability to tolerate those toxins. But you can also see that some members of the Bombus sensu strictu subgenus, which includes Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee, the yellow banded bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, and the western bumblebee, also appear to be using Asclepius at a fairly high rate. So I haven't gotten into it really, but one of the main known threats to that subgenus of bumblebees is actually a fungal pathogen known as Veramorpha bombi. So is it possible that those animals are using the toxic compounds in Asclepius nectar to help mediate some of those fungal pathogens that are out there? Who knows what is going on, but there do seem to be some really interesting patterns in plant use, and we're just starting to dig deeper into these data and think about what it means moving forward. In addition to some of those really great outcomes, we're also using the data from these atlases to inform the species status assessments that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing for these bumblebees to assess extinction risk analysis. This is a paper that came out a couple of years ago about the Western bumblebee that specifically called out our atlas programs as a model for gathering data moving into the future. And then, we're also coming up with habitat recommendations. The guidebook that you see, or the two guides that you see here on the right, were developed using recommendations and case studies from land managers that helped write a guidebook for land managers using data from the atlas that includes detailed plant associations and best management practices. And then we're also using the data from these atlas projects for larger advocacy. So all the stars that you see on the map here are locations where we've detected one of those Endangered Species Act nexus species. So we've detected one of the bumblebees that have been petitioned for Endangered Species Act. The red and gray blobs that you see on this map are areas that USDA APHIS has sprayed huge swaths of land to control grasshopper outbreaks, to protect damage to those systems. And the overhead spraying that they do for grasshoppers is also known to impact bumblebee colonies and cause reproductive losses in those animals. So we've used the presence of those bumblebee species to advocate for reducing grasshopper sprays and changing the management of some of those systems. And partially the information that we gathered from these atlas projects and the locations of these rare bumblebees have led to some advocacy wins. So recently we had a court decision that changed how these lands were sprayed and how these sprays were approved. And so the data are helping to inform broader invertebrate conservation action as well. In addition, we've moved forward with 4 different species of bumblebees. We've petitioned for California Endangered Species Act protection. This is a fairly long process that has been going out since 2018. But recently, in 2022, an appellate court in California ruled that bumblebees can be considered fish in the state of California. And that allowed these animals to be protected under the California Endangered Species Act. There's a larger story here that sort of fills in some of the gaps. Bumblebees are clearly not fish, but there's some language in the code for the Endangered Species Act and the Commission in California that listed fish as and invertebrates in the same sentence, which allowed them to be protected under the Endangered Species Act. So I don't have time to go into the full details of it, but it is a pretty interesting story, and does show you that language that we use matters. Another thing that we've done is use the data from these atlas projects and from the IUCN to advocate that bumblebees be included in state wildlife action plans. So the acronym that you see here, SWAP, means State Wildlife Action Plan, and these are plans that every state in the country puts out with guidance in association with the with guidance from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they all list what are called SGCNs, or species of greatest conservation need. And these are when an animal is listed as a species of greatest conservation need, it means they're available for conservation funding and for conservation action in that state by the state wildlife agency. And in 2005, before any of these programs began, only 3 states included bumblebees in their state wildlife action plans as SGCN. In 2015, after we began some of our advocacy around this, a number of states added bumblebees to their state wildlife action plans, making, these animals available for conservation funding. And a lot of that funding has actually gone, or some of that funding has gone to support our Atlas projects across the country. And then in 2025, we've continued to advocate for this inclusion using the data that we have. And this isn't work that's solely done by the Xerces Society, but the 49 states that have native bumblebees, Hawaii doesn't have any native bumblebees, now have at least one bumblebee listed in their state wildlife action plan as a species of greatest conservation need, which obviously raises the profile of these animals and makes a lot more funding available to help do the work that we're doing to help better understand and then conserve these animals. So every animal now that's on this chart is listed as a species of greatest conservation need in at least one state out there. We've also developed bumblebee conservation plans using the data from the Atlas. This is an example of a plan that we wrote for the state of Washington that's based on the species of conservation concern. It identifies conservation opportunity areas and hotspots and conservation areas of concern. And so again, just want to remind you that, there's this constant feedback between the research community informing policy and advocacy, and then it also works the other way, where policy and advocacy, say the Endangered Species Act, can really change how we manage habitat and how we do management. So lots of interest there and an interesting interplay. And I think a lot of people think about sort of science and advocacy should be separate from each other, but I think it's really important to remember that it's kind of impossible to separate from each other, in that policy has such an important role in funding and in driving real conservation action. And that's sort of the bulk of the bumblebee story, and just a couple more, if I can, just a couple more things that Xerces is doing on the advocacy front. We're using data also from the bumblebee atlases to advocate for responsible placement of honeybees on public lands. So we're working with a number of other organizations listed on the right of this slide here to make sure that federal agencies are considering the presence of rare bumblebees when they approve the use of honeybees on public lands. If you don't know, honeybees can compete with native bees for resources, and they can also spread diseases to them. And we just want to make sure that our federal agencies are following national environmental laws like NEPA when they consider the placement of those honeybee hives on our public lands. And we've had some policy wins in that area as well. And also, if you don't know, the landscape is really different in different states across the country. Insects are not considered wildlife everywhere. There are many states where they're not considered wildlife. And Xerces is using data about pollinators and our Bumblebee Atlas projects and a whole host of other things to go to those states that don't yet consider insects as wildlife. And we're advocating that they get not only the authority to treat insects as wildlife, but also the funding necessary to do so. And so we're actively working in a number of states, specifically in Nevada and Oregon, to try to make that happen. And we helped push legislation through in Colorado and New Mexico to help make it happen recently in those 2 states. So continuing to advocate across the country for the protection these animals need. And with that, I will say a huge thank you to all of our supporters Again, with a shout out to Xerces Society members for all of the work that you're doing out there.